When the French monarchy collapsed, Marie Antoinette's children did not simply disappear with it. Their lives split in two directions so extreme that they almost feel invented. One child became a king in name while locked inside a prison, then died before reaching adolescence. Another spent her teenage years behind the same walls, survived when almost everyone around her was gone, crossed Europe as a political exile, returned to France when the Bourbons came back, stood close to the throne again, and then lost it all a second time. The strangest part is that Marie Antoinette had 4 children. Yet when the crown finally fell, only 2 of them were still alive. That matters, because the story of Marie Antoinette's children is often compressed into the fate of the little boy later called Louis XVII. His story was indeed terrible, but it was only half of what happened after the monarchy vanished. His older sister, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, lived for almost 6 decades after the Revolution and became a living bridge between Versailles, the guillotine, the Bourbon Restoration, Napoleon, another revolution, and a final exile far from France. To understand what became of the Queen's children, we have to begin with a family that had already been losing children before the Revolution took their parents. Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI had 4 children. Their eldest was Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, born at Versailles in December 1778 and known at court as Madame Royale. Their first son, Louis Joseph, arrived in October 1781 and became Dauphin, the heir to the throne. Louis Charles, their second son, was born in March 1785. Their youngest child, Sophie Béatrice, was born the following year. Sophie never reached her first birthday. She died in 1787 at only 11 months old. The loss was private grief inside a family whose public image was already under relentless attack. Then the first Dauphin, Louis Joseph, grew seriously ill. His health had been fragile for years, and evidence from his final illness points to tuberculosis affecting his spine. He died at the Château de Meudon on June 4, 1789, not even 8 years old. The timing was extraordinary. France was already entering the political crisis that would become the Revolution. The Estates General had opened only weeks earlier. While arguments about representation, taxation, authority, and sovereignty were shaking the kingdom, the king and queen were mourning the death of the boy who had been expected to inherit it. Louis Charles, only 4, suddenly became the new Dauphin. So even before the Bastille fell, Marie Antoinette had already buried 2 of her 4 children. That left Marie-Thérèse and Louis Charles. At Versailles they had grown up inside a world built around rank. Their rooms, attendance, education, clothes, and daily rituals all told them where they stood in the social order. Marie-Thérèse was a daughter of France. Louis Charles was the heir. Their father was the king. Their mother was the queen. None of those facts seemed temporary when they were born. Then the revolution turned each title into a liability. In October 1789, crowds came to Versailles and the royal family was compelled to move to Paris. The children went with their parents to the Tuileries Palace. They still lived in a royal residence, but the meaning of royal residence had changed. The family was no longer free in the old sense. They lived under surveillance, surrounded by political suspicion, while arguments over the future of the monarchy became more intense. The attempted flight to Versailles in June 1791 made everything worse. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette hoped to escape the pressure of Paris and reach a position from which the king might recover room to act. Instead, the family was recognized, stopped, and returned under guard. For the children, the journey became another lesson in how quickly royal ceremony could become public humiliation. Crowds that once bowed now watched them as prisoners in all but name. The final collapse came in August 1792. Insurgents attacked the Tuileries on August 10th. The royal family sought protection from the Legislative Assembly, but the king was suspended. 3 days later, Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, Marie-Thérèse, Louis Charles, and the king's sister Madame Elizabeth were confined in the Temple, a fortified complex in Paris dominated by a medieval tower. The French crown was not formally abolished that same day. That came on September 21, 1792, when the National Convention unanimously abolished royalty. But for the children, the practical destruction of their old life had already happened. They were no longer living in palaces. Their movements were controlled. Their future depended on a revolutionary government fighting war abroad and political enemies at home. Here was the governing problem that made Louis Charles especially dangerous. Under the logic of hereditary monarchy, a king did not need an election to be succeeded. When one king died, the crown passed immediately to the next lawful heir. Royalists expressed the idea in the old formula that the king was dead and the king lived. The Republic rejected the entire system, but Royalists did not. That meant the little boy in the temple was not merely the son of a deposed monarch. If his father died, Royalists could regard him as the rightful king. And his father did die. Louis XVI was tried by the Convention, condemned, and executed on January 21, 1793. To the Republic, he was Louis Capet, a former king convicted of treason. To monarchists, he was a martyr. And to Royalists who still recognized hereditary succession, his young son immediately became Louis XVII. The title sounded grand. The reality was the opposite. Louis Charles was 7 years old, locked in the temple with no government, no court, no army he could command, and no freedom. He was a king only in the eyes of people who wanted the monarchy restored. Several foreign royal courts and French royalists treated him as the legitimate sovereign. The Republic treated him as a captive child whose bloodline made him politically valuable and potentially dangerous. This is the central contradiction of his life after the crown fell. The moment that supposedly made him king also made his captivity more important. At first the family remained together enough to preserve some routine. Louis XVI had educated his son during the early months in the temple. Marie Antoinette and Madame Elizabeth cared for the children. But the prison steadily dismantled the family one person at a time. On July 3, 1793, officials removed Louis Charles from his mother. Marie-Thérèse later described the separation as a scene of desperation. Whatever later royalist writers added to the story, the basic fact is not disputed. The 8-year-old boy was taken away and placed under the supervision of Antoine Simon, a shoemaker and temple commissioner. The purpose was political as well as custodial. Revolutionaries wanted the boy separated from the royal identity that surrounded him. Under Simon, he was pressed to renounce the world into which he had been born. Statements attributed to the child were later used against Marie Antoinette. Among the accusations at her trial was the monstrous claim of incest with her son. Marie Antoinette rejected it and appealed to the mothers present in the courtroom. The accusation has long been understood as part of the political degradation surrounding her trial, not as a credible fact about the family. For Louis Charles, the episode showed what his title now meant. He had no power to protect his mother. Instead, his name and his words could be used against her. Marie Antoinette was transferred from the temple to the conciergerie in August. Marie-Thérèse remained behind with her aunt Madame Elizabeth. The Queen was tried in October and executed on October 16, 1793. Her children were not brought to say goodbye. That left a brother and sister inside the same prison complex, separated from one another, each surrounded by uncertainty. Louis Charles's treatment became harsher after Simon left his post in January 1794. The exact details of every story told later about beatings and deliberate torment are difficult to prove, and royalist memory sometimes turned the boy's suffering into legend. But there is strong evidence that he endured prolonged isolation, terrible hygiene, little exercise, psychological distress, and serious physical decline. Marie-Thérèse's own account described her brother living alone in a filthy room, with poor bedding, vermin, no useful occupation, and periods without light. She was writing as his sister and as a committed Bourbon, so her account has an emotional and political viewpoint. Yet later medical and administrative evidence also confirms that the child's health deteriorated severely. The boy who had once been raised as Dauphin was now spending his days in confinement, increasingly sick and withdrawn. Marie-Thérèse, meanwhile, still had Madame Elizabeth. That relationship became essential. Her aunt was the last adult member of the immediate family beside her inside the temple. But in May 1794, officials came for Elizabeth too. She was taken away, tried, condemned, and executed on May 10th. Marie-Thérèse was now alone. What made her isolation even more cruel was that she did not know the full truth. She knew her father was dead. She did not receive clear news of what had happened to her mother or her aunt. Her memoir describes repeated attempts to ask officials for information and repeated refusals to answer. For long stretches, she lived with uncertainty instead of confirmed grief. Imagine the strange geography of that prison. Somewhere within the same complex, her younger brother was still alive. Marie-Thérèse knew he existed, worried about him, and sometimes heard signs of activity connected with his room. But she could not simply walk to him. She could not comfort him. She could not tell him what she knew, because she did not know the whole truth herself. The revolution had not only stripped the family of a throne. It had broken the most ordinary thing a family possesses, the ability to reach one another. After the fall of Robespierre in July 1794, conditions in the temple gradually changed. New keepers treated Marie-Thérèse more civilly. She received more books, light, and better daily treatment. Louis Charles also received more attention. Officials who saw him were shocked by his condition. He was cleaned, given better bedding, and eventually allowed some movement and air. But the change came very late. His body was already failing. His joints became swollen. Walking became difficult. Fevers returned. Doctors were called. One physician, Pierre-Joseph Dessalles, examined him and died soon afterward from an illness of his own. Other doctors followed, including Philippe-Jean Pelletan. By the spring of 1795, the boy's decline was unmistakable. He died in the temple on June 8, 1795. He was 10 years old. For royalists, Louis XVII had died a king without ever ruling. For the Republic, a politically dangerous prisoner had died in custody. For his sister, the death meant something simpler and more devastating. She was now the only surviving child of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. But even then, she did not immediately receive the full story. The death of Louis Charles produced one of the strangest afterlives in royal history. During the autopsy, the surgeon Pelletan removed the boy's heart and preserved it. The body itself was buried without the kind of royal funeral that would once have surrounded a dauphin, much less a child claimed by monarchists as king. Soon rumors spread that the boy who died in the temple was not really Louis Charles. Perhaps, people said, he had escaped and another child had been substituted. Over the following decades, men appeared claiming to be the lost prince. The most famous was Karl Wilhelm Naundorff, a Prussian clockmaker who built an entire identity around the claim that he had survived the temple. The rumors lasted because the boy's fate was politically useful to almost everyone. Royalists could imagine a stolen king. Pretenders could build lives around the mystery. Enemies of the revolution could point to the prison as evidence of revolutionary cruelty. Skeptics could ask why so much about the child's final months seemed hidden, confused, or badly documented. The sister who had actually lived through the temple did not believe the escape story. Marie-Thérèse accepted that her brother had died there. Modern science would eventually support that conclusion, but not for another 2 centuries. In the summer of 1795, Marie-Thérèse finally learned what had happened to the people she had been asking about for so long. Her mother was dead. Her aunt was dead. Her brother was dead. She was 16, approaching 17, and every other member of the immediate family who had entered the temple with her was gone. That created a new political question. What was the Republic supposed to do with the daughter of Louis XVI? She was no longer a direct male claimant to the crown, but she was far from politically meaningless. To monarchists, she was the surviving child of the martyred royal couple, almost a living relic of the fallen monarchy. To Austria, she was a Habsburg relative through her mother. To the French government, she could be exchanged. That is exactly what happened. Negotiations led to an agreement under which Marie-Thérèse would be released in exchange for French prisoners held by Austria. In December 1795, around her 17th birthday, she left the temple after more than 3 years of confinement. The contrast was almost impossible to miss. She had entered the prison as a king's daughter. She left as an orphan being transferred across borders in a diplomatic exchange. She traveled toward Basel and then on to Vienna, the city where her mother had been born. She was free from the temple, but she was not free from dynastic politics. Her survival had made her important. Freedom also forced Marie-Thérèse to do something she had been unable to do inside the temple: reconstruct the missing years. She had survived a prison in which information itself had been controlled. Outside it, she had to learn the sequence of deaths and separations that had happened around her. Later, she wrote an account of the family's captivity. That memoir is important not because every line should be treated as neutral evidence, but because it preserves the viewpoint of the one child who lived long enough to describe the experience in her own voice. She remembered repeated searches, the uncertainty about her mother, the removal of her aunt, and her fear for her brother. The revolution had reduced her family to prisoners. Her memoir helped turn those prisoners back into remembered individuals. That also meant Marie-Thérèse became valuable to the Bourbon cause in a way no speechwriter could manufacture. She did not need to be introduced as a symbol. Her biography did the work. Royalists could point to the orphan daughter of Louis XVI and ask supporters to see the revolution through her losses. This gave her enormous emotional importance, but it also made ordinary privacy difficult. From the moment she left the temple, her grief belonged partly to politics. Vienna, therefore, was not simply a safe home after prison. It was another court, another diplomatic environment, and another place where her marriage mattered. She was a young woman with royal blood from both Bourbon and Habsburg lines. Who she married could strengthen one dynastic connection and weaken another. She wanted to remain tied to her father's family. The solution eventually brought her to the exiled Bourbons and to Louis Antoine. At Vienna, Marie-Thérèse encountered a different branch of her identity. She was a Bourbon princess, but she was also the granddaughter of Empress Maria Theresa through Marie Antoinette. The Austrian court could shelter her, display sympathy toward her, and also think about her as a valuable marriage connection. She resisted plans that would separate her from the Bourbon cause. What she wanted was to rejoin her father's surviving brothers and the royalist family in exile. Eventually she was allowed to do so. In June 1799, at Mittau in Courland, in what is now Latvia, Marie-Thérèse married her cousin Louis Antoine, Duke of Angoulême. He was the eldest son of the Count of Artois, Louis XVI's younger brother and the future King Charles X. The marriage changed her position again. She was no longer only the daughter of the dead king. She was now tied directly to the senior Bourbon line that hoped to return to France. The couple had no children. The marriage at Mittau did more than give Marie-Thérèse a husband. It joined the last surviving child of Louis XVI to the branch most likely to carry the senior Bourbon succession forward. Her husband's father, the future Charles X, stood behind Louis XVIII in the family order. Marie-Thérèse had once been the sister of the heir. Now she was married into the line of future heirs. The years that followed stripped royal life down to its essentials. There were still titles, etiquette, loyalties, and plans for restoration, but there was no French state paying for a Versailles court. The Bourbons depended on foreign hosts and moved as European war changed their options. Marie-Thérèse lived with the royal family in exile and eventually spent years in England. The contrast with her childhood was enormous. Versailles had been built to make monarchy look permanent. Exile proved that even kings could become long-term guests. This was also when the strange numbering of the Bourbon kings became fixed. Marie-Thérèse's uncle, the Count of Provence, took the title Louis XVIII. He chose that number because royalists counted the dead child in the temple as Louis XVII. In other words, Louis Charles never ruled France, but his claimed reign was preserved inside the very name of the king who hoped to return after him. The imprisoned boy had become part of Bourbon constitutional memory. That fact would become increasingly important. Marie-Thérèse was the only one of Marie Antoinette's children to survive into adulthood, but she would not create a new line descended from Louis XVI. The biological line of the king and queen ended with her. For the moment, however, the larger question was not succession. It was survival in exile. Marie-Thérèse spent years moving with the Bourbon court through Europe. The royal family lived in places such as Courland and later England, dependent on the politics and hospitality of other monarchies. Her uncle, the Count of Provence, called himself Louis XVIII after the death of the child recognized by royalists as Louis XVII. In royalist theory, the crown had continued even though the Bourbons controlled no France. That meant Marie-Thérèse lived in a world of titles without territory. She had been Madame Royale at Versailles. Her brother had been called king in a prison. Her uncle called himself king in exile. Her husband belonged to a family that expected history to reverse itself. For years, it did not. Napoleon rose from revolutionary France to become first consul and then emperor. The Bourbons remained outside the country, waiting for a collapse that seemed, at times, unlikely ever to come. Then it came. In 1814, after Napoleon's defeat, the Bourbon monarchy was restored. Louis XVIII returned to France as king. Marie-Thérèse returned with the family. Think about what that meant for her. She had left France as a teenage prisoner exchanged at the border. She came back as the Duchess of Angoulême, niece of the restored king, wife of a prince close to the succession, and the only surviving child of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. The return was a political restoration, but it was also an encounter with memory. The restored monarchy deliberately honored the dead royal family. The remains of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, buried after their executions in the former Madeleine Cemetery, were located and transferred to the royal necropolis at the Basilica of Saint Denis in January 1815. A commemorative chapel was also planned at the old burial site. Marie-Thérèse had gone from being denied news of her mother inside the temple to standing in a restored Bourbon France that publicly mourned her parents. Yet even this extraordinary reversal did not bring stability. The restored monarchy also transformed private mourning into public architecture. The return of the Bourbons meant that the deaths of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette could be commemorated by the state rather than whispered about by exiles. Saint Denis once again became the setting for royal memory. The site of the old Madeleine Cemetery was marked by what became the Chapelle Expiatoire. For Marie-Thérèse, these projects were not distant historical memorials. They concerned the parents she had been prevented from seeing in their final months. This is why her story after 1814 cannot be reduced to a happy restoration. She recovered rank, family position, and access to France, but she did so inside a government that constantly argued about how much of the old monarchy could be revived. To liberals, the restored court could appear obsessed with reversing the revolution. To committed royalists, it had not reversed nearly enough. Marie-Thérèse stood emotionally close to the most painful memories of 1793, so compromise was never merely abstract for her. Napoleon escaped from Elba in early 1815 and returned to France. The restored Bourbon government began to collapse almost as quickly as it had appeared. Marie-Thérèse was in Bordeaux with her husband when news of Napoleon's advance reached them. Her husband left to take command elsewhere, but she remained and tried to organize resistance. This was not the frightened child of the temple. She was now a woman in her 30s acting as a political symbol and encouraging loyalty to the Bourbon cause. The effort failed. Napoleon's return gathered momentum. Forces loyal to him approached Bordeaux. Marie-Thérèse eventually had to leave, embarking from Pauillac in early April and going into exile again. There is a striking irony here. The revolution had driven her from France as a girl. Napoleon's 100 Days drove her out as a restored princess. Twice she saw a Bourbon return collapse around her. Her stand in Bordeaux later became one of the most celebrated episodes of her public life. Paintings and prints showed the Duchess of Angoulême as the loyal Bourbon princess refusing to surrender the city without an effort. The image was useful to the restored monarchy because it reversed the old temple story. The former prisoner was now the person urging others to resist. Yet the ending was still an embarkation into exile. She left from Pauillac as Napoleon's forces advanced, another departure from a France that her family had briefly recovered. That moment also shows how much Marie-Thérèse had changed. As a child, political decisions happened to her. Adults chose whether she moved from Versailles to Paris, whether she entered the temple, whether she could see her mother, and whether she would be released. By 1815, she was making political decisions herself. She could not stop Napoleon, but she could choose to remain, organize, appeal for loyalty, and leave only when resistance had become impossible. After Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, Louis XVIII returned again. So did Marie-Thérèse. This second restoration lasted. For the next years, she occupied a place close to power, But the France she returned to could never simply become the France of her childhood. The revolution had changed law, society, property, political expectations, and the idea of sovereignty itself. The Bourbons could restore a crown. They could not restore 1788. Marie-Thérèse also carried the temple everywhere she went. Contemporaries often described her as severe, reserved, or marked by sorrow. Royalist admirers saw dignity and religious endurance. Critics saw a woman attached to a reactionary political world. Both impressions could coexist. She had reasons to distrust revolution, and she remained strongly loyal to the senior Bourbon line. Her personal tragedy became inseparable from her political identity. In 1824, Louis XVIII died. His brother, the Count of Artois, became King Charles X. Marie-Thérese's husband, Louis Antoine, became Dauphin, heir to the throne. Marie-Thérèse was now Dauphine of France. The title created one of the most extraordinary status reversals in modern royal history. A girl who had once been kept alone in a revolutionary prison was now the wife of the heir to a restored French king. The family that had been treated as finished in the 1790s once again occupied the Tuileries and the ceremonial heart of the monarchy. But the position contained a weakness that no ceremony could solve. Marie-Thérèse and Louis Antoine had no children. If her husband became king, there would be no son or daughter of theirs to inherit. The future of the senior Bourbon line depended instead on the younger branch descended through Louis Antoine's brother, the Duke of Berry. That branch produced a boy, Henri, Duke of Bordeaux, who became the dynasty's hope. So the only surviving child of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette stood close to the throne, but could not pass her parents' bloodline forward through descendants of her own. Then France revolted again. Charles X pursued a strongly conservative course and clashed with the political system created by the Constitutional Charter. In July 1830, after the king issued ordinances restricting the press and reshaping the electorate, Paris erupted. The July Revolution destroyed his position. For Marie-Thérèse, history was repeating itself with brutal precision. Once again there were barricades, a collapsing Bourbon government, a family deciding whether it could hold the capital, and the threat of another forced departure. Charles X abdicated in August. What happened next created one of the strangest footnotes in European monarchy. Under strict hereditary logic, once Charles abdicated, the crown could be said to have passed to his son Louis Antoine, Marie-Thérese's husband. Louis Antoine then renounced his own rights so that the claim could pass to the young Henri. Later popular accounts turned the interval into a famous story. Louis Antoine was supposedly King Louis XIX for about 20 minutes, which would have made Marie-Thérèse queen for the same brief span. The reality is more complicated. The abdication document itself continued to refer to Louis Antoine as Dauphin, and the political transfer was intended to move directly toward the young Henri. Historians therefore dispute whether Louis Antoine ever truly reigned, even for minutes. Marie-Thérèse was never officially crowned or recognized by the French state as reigning queen. But the legend survives because it captures the absurd closeness of her life to a throne she could never securely possess. She had been born the daughter of one king. She had been the sister of a boy royalists called another king. She became the niece of a restored king and the daughter-in-law of the next. For a disputed handful of minutes, dynastic logic could even describe her as queen. Then she was an exile again. The July monarchy placed Louis Philippe, from the Orleans branch of the royal family, on the throne. The senior Bourbons left France. Marie-Thérèse followed them out. She would never return to live in France. The exiled court moved first to Britain, including a period in Edinburgh, then later to Central Europe. Charles X died in 1836. Legitimists who rejected Louis Philippe continued to recognize the senior Bourbon claims. In their eyes, Marie-Thérese's husband was now the rightful Louis XIX, even though he did not rule France. When Louis Antoine died in 1844, the legitimist claim passed to Henri, Count of Chambord, the child the family had tried to place at the center of the succession after 1830. Marie-Thérèse remained one of the dynasty's most important figures. She had no children, but she acted as an elder presence around the younger Bourbon generation. Her significance no longer came from the possibility that she would produce heirs. Came from memory. She was the last surviving child of the king and queen killed by the revolution. That made her something no one else in the family could be. A younger Bourbon could argue about legitimacy. A royalist writer could describe the temple. A priest could preach about the executed king and queen. But Marie-Thérèse had been there. She had watched the old court disappear, endured imprisonment, lost her parents, brother, and aunt, crossed into exile, returned with the Restoration, resisted Napoleon's return, become Dauphine, and been expelled by another revolution. Her body had become a timeline of the Bourbon struggle with modern France. Her final years were spent mostly in the Habsburg world, including at Frosdorf south of Vienna. She remained loyal to the legitimist cause and to the family around the Count of Chambord. In October 1851, Marie-Thérèse died. She was in her early 70s. She died without children, more than half a century after leaving the temple, and only weeks before France entered yet another dramatic political transformation that would soon bring Napoleon III to imperial power. Even in death, her story did not return neatly to France. Marie-Thérèse was buried with the exiled Bourbons at Kostanjevica, near Gorizia, in what is now Nova Gorica in Slovenia. The Franciscan monastery there became known as a kind of little St. Denis because it holds the tombs of Charles X, Louis Antoine, Marie-Thérèse, and other members of the exiled senior Bourbon line. That is where the only child of Marie Antoinette to reach adulthood still lies. Her brother's story ended differently. The body of Louis Charles had not received a royal burial in 1795, but the heart taken during his autopsy began an extraordinary journey of its own. It passed through different hands and eventually reached St. Denis. The problem was authenticity. Was this really the heart of the child who died in the temple? And even if it was, had the child truly been Louis Charles? The old escape story still had believers. At the end of the 20th century, researchers tested genetic material from the preserved heart. They compared mitochondrial DNA, which follows the maternal line, with genetic material connected to Marie Antoinette and her Habsburg maternal relatives. The results strongly supported the historical account. The heart belonged to a child from Marie Antoinette's maternal line, fitting the conclusion that Louis Charles really did die in the temple. The evidence undercut the most famous survival theories that had filled books and fueled pretenders for 2 centuries. In June 2004, on the anniversary of Louis Charles's death, the preserved heart was formally placed in the Bourbon chapel of the Basilica of St. Denis. The boy who had been called king without a throne finally received a royal resting place, at least for the surviving part of him that history had preserved. That gives the story of Marie Antoinette's children an almost impossible final geography. 2 of the 4 died before the monarchy itself collapsed. Sophie died as an infant. Louis Joseph, the first Dauphin, died of disease in June 1789, just as the revolution was beginning. The 2 who lived long enough to see the crown fall were taken into the temple. Louis Charles became Louis XVII to royalists after his father's execution, but he never ruled. He was separated from his mother, kept in confinement, became gravely ill, and died at 10 in June 1795. His heart now rests at St. Denis near the tombs of his parents. Marie-Thérèse survived. She was released in a prisoner exchange, lived in exile, married her cousin Louis Antoine, returned to France with the Bourbon Restoration, resisted Napoleon during the 100 Days, became Dauphine, watched another revolution overthrow her family in 1830, and spent the rest of her life outside France. She died childless in 1851 and rests with the exiled Bourbons in Slovenia. So what became of Marie Antoinette's children after the French crown fell? The crown did not save them. In one case, royal blood made a child more valuable as a prisoner. In the other, it turned a surviving daughter into a political symbol for the rest of her life. One sibling inherited a title he could never use. The other recovered royal status only to discover that restoration could be temporary. And perhaps that is the most revealing part of the story. Dynasties are built around the idea that inheritance creates continuity. A crown passes from parent to child, then to the next generation, making power seem almost permanent. Marie Antoinette's family became the opposite. An empty cradle came first, then an empty dauphin's place, then a boy king without a kingdom, then a surviving daughter without descendants. The family name continued through other Bourbons, But the direct line of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette ended with Marie-Thérèse. Today, you can still trace that collapse in physical places. At Versailles, rooms preserve the memory of the children before the revolution. At St. Denis, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette lie in the royal necropolis, and the heart associated with their son rests in the Bourbon chapel. Far to the east, at Kostanjevica, Marie-Thérèse lies in exile beside the family that lost France again in 1830. The children were born expecting the crown to organize their futures. Instead, the fall of that crown organized their fates. Which fallen royal family should we follow next?